Hello, Consciously Parenting family, and welcome to the Conscious Coffee Break. Today we are going to talk about limits versus boundaries. And if you're thinking, aren't those the same thing? Then you're in the right place because there's a lot of confusion about what these two words mean and whether they actually mean the same or something different. Hi, I'm Jen Kobrick. I'm a holistic family consultant with the Consciously Parenting Project, and this is the Conscious Coffee Break. So, we hear over and over again about how kids need limits. And there's an entire industry that is all about telling us what these limits should be, right? What time bedtime should be, what screen time should be, what meals should be, what kind of food kids should eat. And you may have noticed that some of these shoulds don't seem to fit neatly into your parenting, your family, your child, your life. And this can produce a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear and worry for parents about this, this feeling of if there's a right way, if there's a should and I'm not doing it, then is there something wrong with me? Is there something wrong with my child? Is there something wrong with my parenting? And kids need limits, right? So if the limits I'm trying to set are not working, then am I going to ruin my kids by not setting those limits? And there is a lot of research to show that not having any kind of limits, not having any kind of boundaries, what's called permissive parenting, the say yes to anything no matter what, the self-sacrificing, where the parent's own needs are not being met, or where the child is doing things that are clearly inappropriate or dangerous, and not having anyone stopping that's not good. That's not healthy for our children's development, and it's not healthy for us either as adults to not be able to ever say no. So that's why we talk about boundaries. So children don't actually need limits in the sense of we don't need to artificially limit their world. The goal is not to artificially limit what they have access to or what their choices are, but they do need boundaries. They do need to know where the edges are. So you can think about this, if you were to think about this, you could think about, imagine that you are walking in an open field. So a limit would be you may only walk on this one narrow pathway across this field for no particular reason. Not going to damage anything by walking out of that space. There's no purpose to it. It's just, it has been decided that this is the one lane in which it is okay to walk. A boundary would be more like, okay, here's the edge of the field where the highway is, so we're going to stay in the field. There's a clear reason for the boundary, and the boundary is not artificial. I mean, it's artificial that the road has been built there, but it's not artificial in the sense of somebody just decided that this was the one path. So then within the boundary, how you move through the field could look like walking through the narrow path down the middle, or it could look like zigzagging around the grass, or it could look like walking partway out and then turning around and coming back the same way. But there's a lot more room for what is the way to move through this field that feels good right now. There's a lot more options, a lot more space for creativity, and a lot more space for figuring out each person's own right answer rather than just one should. So limits are sort of a shortcut. In order to figure out where the boundaries are, there's a lot of work that has to be done. So a boundary is going to look different for different people and maybe even on different days. Different children are going to have different ways of interacting with the world. So different children may need different boundaries. Different adults have different ways of interacting with the world. So we're going to have different boundaries. And on any given day, on a day that I've slept 5 hours versus a day that I've slept 8 hours, I'm going to have different capacities to deal with anything. And so my boundaries are going to be different from one day to the next. When there's a lot of stress happening in life, my boundaries are going to be different from when there's not. When I have a lot of support, my boundaries are going to be different from when I don't. So boundaries requires a lot of, in this moment, what do I need? In this moment, what does my child need? In this moment, if I say yes, am I going to be resentful? And if I say no, am I going to feel angry? If I say yes now, when I don't really mean it, does that mean I'm going to say no later and not have the capacity to deal with the pushback for that no? In which case, maybe I need to say no now while I have the capacity to deal with the feelings that come up because of the no. Is there a way that I could say yes? Is this I'm not willing to get the paint out at 10 o'clock at night, but I can say yes with a qualifier, right? I would be happy to help you paint tomorrow. Or I would be happy to help you paint after lunch. Or I would be happy to help you paint outside where I don't have to worry about paint on the walls. So sometimes boundaries can look like a negotiation of how can I get my need and your need met, or some part of my need and some part of your need, or how can I set the limit in a way that respects your feelings and validates your experience instead of just, well, the book said that you have to go to bed at 8 o'clock on the dot. So limits are a shortcut, right? Limits are, it's easy. You don't have to think about limits. You can just say, but the rule is X, Y, and Z, and therefore we will do X, Y, and Z. And setting a limit in that sense, that rigid, this is the rule, there's no negotiation, then there's no thinking required. We don't have to sit with, does that feel good to me? Is that really meeting your needs? Do I really have the capacity for this right now? Sometimes the limits are actually too much. Sometimes our boundary is actually before the limit, but because we're focused on this rigid limit, we think that we have to go all the way to that limit, even if our capacity was actually back here. And it can work the other way too, of course, where the limit is here, but our capacity is actually further than that. And so we could say yes at the limit, authentically say yes. Limits circumvent all of that, and that makes them really appealing because it means that there's no need for all of that messy work. But both all of that messy work and setting the boundaries instead of the limits are how we get our needs and our child's needs met, but also that's where the healing and the growth happens. If we're just setting rigid limits and adhering to them, and especially if those rigid limits are coming from some outside source, like a book or a parent, our own parents or society or a friend, if somebody else is deciding where those limits and those rules should be, then we're not doing any of the processing. And it's in that processing, in that sitting with, what are my needs? What are my feelings? Where are my boundaries? How can we get creative about this? How can I get support to help make sure that this happens because it's too much for one person to do? How can I negotiate with another person, with a partner, with a child, about what everybody needs and about how we can creatively accomplish that? All of that that's where the healing and the growth is, because that's where we take a deep, long look at ourselves, at our families, at our social structures, at the way our whole lives are set up. And when we can make conscious choices and choose what really feels good to us, for me, for my family, for my child, for my relationships, when we really make those choices, that's so empowering. When we see doing the work and then the results of that, of feeling more connected, of feeling more authentic, of feeling more in touch with our own bodies and feelings, that is empowering. And then that's a snowball effect that then as we feel that empowerment, then we feel empowered to do that in more areas of our lives. And that is such a healing cycle versus setting somebody else's limit and enforcing it and becoming the enforcer for rules that don't feel authentic. That is so disempowering. That feels like I have no choice but to enforce this thing, even though it doesn't feel good. And that doesn't feel good to us. It doesn't feel good to our children. It doesn't feel connecting. So the reality is, our children don't need limits. Our children need boundaries, and we need boundaries. And learning how to find our own boundaries and helping our children find their boundaries is powerful healing work. So if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the comments. Please feel free to reach out and send us a private message if you have questions as well, especially if you don't want to post them publicly. And if it feels like you could use a little help figuring out where your boundaries are or figuring out how to hold your boundaries respectfully, then please definitely reach out to us and we can help match you with one of our holistic family consultants who can help you with that and hold that space for you and your family with compassion. All right, have a great week, and I will see you next week on the Conscious Coffee Break.